Hey, welcome back to K-12 Analytics Engineering. I am Marcos Alcozer, and today we'll be talking about Google Forms. We'll be covering best practices for extracting, loading, and transforming data out of Google Forms, as well as some pitfalls that I've run into in my own work and how I've managed to avoid them. And so what we're going to do is we'll spend most of the time over here looking at my desktop, walking through the various parts of extracting data from Google Forms. And we're going to start with this sample form here that I have, and we'll walk through how to extract the data out of it and get it visualized in Google Data Studio. So if we look at this Google form, this is a form that's asking the person a few different questions. This first one, what is your name? And then we have a radio button kind of choice select question here of level of comfort putting ketchup on a hot dog. So if you're around Chicago, like I am, I'm in Chicago, you may be pretty uncomfortable with ketchup on a hot dog. Other places in the country, you may be getting more comfortable. And so we've got that question here. We have your favorite season, and then we have a nice scale question of how likely are you to recommend Google Forms to a friend. And then we have another page of questions here. So in Google Forms, when you have your respondents complete the form, Google will show you the responses here inside of Google Forms, and it will also allow you to move that data into a Google Sheet. And you get this very wide Google Sheet of all of your question responses. And this is typically the data set that an analyst will use to visualize the data, but they'll pretty quickly run into a few problems here. So let's look at one of them, which is represented in this Google Data Studio dashboard. So we have our question here of level of comfort putting ketchup on a hot dog, and we have our responses. So this form was taken 3 times, and the respondents chose 2 of the options. So uncomfortable was chosen twice. And so here we have a nice pie chart that's showing us that data, and then we have our column chart here at the bottom. But if we look at Google Forms and we look at the visuals that they give us here in the application, what we see is we see their pie chart. And this is a nicer one because all options are shown here. So even though comfortable and deeply uncomfortable were not chosen, I can still see here in my legend that they were options for the question. And that really comes across as a nice thing to have when you look at something like this column chart here, and you realize, well, you'd like to have those other 2 options there on the x-axis. And so why is this happening? The core of why this is happening is because this Google Sheet here, this data set is the question responses. This is not a data set of questions on the Google form. It's a data set of the responses. And so we are seeing very comfortable and we are seeing uncomfortable here because those are the things that were chosen, but we're not seeing the other options. And so for you to get these kind of complete visualizations, you would need every option to be chosen at least once. And you cannot guarantee that. You also have, if that does happen, you don't know if it's going to happen closer to when people start completing the form, and so your visuals start to look nice, or whether you have to wait until many people complete it. And all of that just gets a little messy and uncomfortable. And so we don't want to use this Google Sheet. We want to pull the data via a different method. And Google does provide us with a better method, which is the Google Forms API. This API is in restricted beta. What that means is you have to complete a Google form to gain access to it, and then Google will whitelist your Google Workspace domain or your Google Workspace email account so that you can start to make API calls. And they do this because they're still making some breaking changes to the API. I signed up about a month ago. I have not seen a breaking change. It took them about 24 hours to grant me access, so I do think it's starting to get pretty stable. They've also said that this is moving to open beta, within the next couple of months. So I think it is a good time to dive in and start to use this API. And so this API has a couple endpoints that will give us what we want. It has forms where you can get a form and you pass in the form ID and it will return an instance of a form. And the instance of a form has things like the form ID, which is if you're ever editing a form, it sits up here in the omnibar. It also has things such as items, where it will give you an array of the items or the questions that are being asked on the Google form. And so this will give you that base metadata for the form. And then it has a responses. And this more closely matches that data that you get from the Google Sheet. So what I have here then to show you is I've got a Jupyter notebook here where in a Google Cloud project, I enabled the Google Forms API and I created an API key. And then I am able to run this code to actually fetch data from the Google Forms API for this Google form. So let's do that, and I'll walk you through the different parts. So here we have our Google form, and I'm going to go ahead and copy the key, and then I'll go back to my notebook, and I'll run this cell by cell to show you. So here I'm importing the Google API client. I'm pulling the API key from my environment variable, and then I have a list of two API scopes that I'm going to use to pull this data. And so when I run this, up at the top, my notebook is asking me for the email the script should impersonate. My account owns this Google form, and the API call, though, is happening through a service account. So the service account is actually going to impersonate my account when retrieving those responses. If you've ever pulled from the Google Classroom API, it's pretty similar to how you pull data there. And so I'll put in that email, and then I'll put in the Google Forms ID. And so now the next part is I actually build the credential. That is all of this. And then I go and I run this get command for the form ID. So when I do that, I now have this data. And what this is this is the JSON response from the Google Forms API that has my Google Forms metadata in it. So I can see things such as a document title of sample survey for ETL. I see that items array that I mentioned, and I can see an item right here, item ID, title is what is your name, first and last name. Here's our level of comfort putting ketchup on a hot dog. And I can see the various choices that the person has when they're completing the Google form. And then I also have an API call here for the responses. And this is more JSON. So this notebook is publicly available. If you go to my GitHub, I'll also link it in the description. But if you go to my GitHub, I have a notebooks repo. And I have a Google Forms notebook where you can pull this code and you can build upon it to get your data out of Google Forms. Now the next part I'm going to show you though is how I've taken this code and put it inside of a data orchestration tool to be able to do the whole pipeline. So what I mean by that is how to extract the data out of Google Forms, how to load it somewhere. In this example, it's going to be Google BigQuery. Once it's loaded, how to then transform it into something that can be used to create reports. So for that, I use a tool called Dagster. Dagster is a great data orchestration platform, and I'll walk you through kind of what that looks like. I have a job created in Dagster, and so what we see here at the top is we have two what are called ops. One is get form questions and then get form responses. These two ops actually run in parallel, which is really nice. And so these don't depend on each other, so they can run at the same time and they can extract the data, which you see here in this nice little pill. So it extracts the data, and it then loads the data, loads JSON strings to BigQuery, and then after it loads, then it runs my DBT models. And so what that looks like is when I run this, here I've got the form ID. So I go ahead and launch this, and this is going to be just a very simple visual of here it's getting the data in parallel, it's done getting the data, it's loading it into BigQuery. Now we've got that into BigQuery, and then it's running the data model. I'll show you what that looks like in BigQuery, and then we can look at some of the actual code behind it. So in BigQuery, the first place it lands it is in a data set called raw Google Forms. So I have the two endpoints represented here as forms and forms responses. If I go to preview it, I have a column for ID, and then I have a column called data where I'm just dumping the whole JSON in as a string. And for responses, there are 3 responses to this form, and so we have 3 records here. We have the ID for each response, and we have the JSON string. What happens next with these DBT models is SQL gets run to take this data and transform it into 3 tidier tables. So we have forms. Here's my form ID, my form title. Questions. This is a bit easier to read, right? All of these are for the same form ID. Each question has their own ID. Level of comfort, putting ketchup on a hot dog. It's a choice question, and there are 4 options. So I've taken that JSON string and I've transformed it into a nice native BigQuery table using native data types like nested and repeated fields. And then I've got my responses. So this form has a response that was submitted at this timestamp, and then here are the responses. So this Google Forms data set, this creates my base data model for Google Forms data. But now I want to build a report off of it. And so what I need to do is I need to query these 3 tables, and I need to produce what I call the reporting table that's going to be used in Data Studio. And so if I go under reporting, we can see the end result, and we'll look at the code after I show you the end result. And we have a table here called Google Forms. So that's my reporting table name for this example. Let's call it Google Forms. And if I preview the data, we don't have those nested repeated fields anymore. We just have a nice kind of flat table structure with the Google Forms question and response data. And this is the difference. Level of comfort, putting ketchup on a hot dog. The options that were not chosen are here as questions, and we simply don't have any data for responses. But now, instead of the Google Sheet, which is the responses data, I now have a data set that is the question data that also includes the responses. And so what I can report on now is the question data, and I can source that from BigQuery. And so now I've recreated that question from Google Forms. Level of comfort, putting ketchup on a hot dog. I have my 4 options here, and then I have the 2 that were chosen and how much of the whole they represent. I also have my column chart down here, and I'm showing deeply uncomfortable and comfortable even though those were not selected. And so if a person is seeing the form, if they're seeing this Data Studio report, they now can understand, well, what were the options on the question, and then what were the responses. So to figure out how I got from the notebook proof of concept code to Dagster, I also have that code publicly available, and I'll walk you through at least the DBT model parts of it. So in this code, there'll be an Alcozer folder, and that's my Dagster code. And so we have things like Google Forms, and this is setting up the actual pipeline of retrieving that data. and then creating jobs out of that pipeline. Dagster keeps the pipeline and the jobs separate because it lets you actually define different types of jobs. An example here is I have a dev job that when I run it, it saves a bunch of the data locally on my PC, and then it uploads it into BigQuery under those dev data sets in BigQuery, and then a separate prod one. And so having those separate environments lets me test things in my development environment without messing up my production environment, which may contain a report that somebody's actively using. And so I've got that separation. And if you want a deep dive on Dagster, just let me know. I can do a video. It'll probably take a whole series, kind of go through the various parts, but it's been a really great tool to use. Now, DBT, I've talked about before on this channel. This is the tool used to manage my SQL transformation work. This is where I'm holding all the SQL to create those tables I showed you in BigQuery. So I showed you, let's look at it, that under Dev Google Forms, I have forms, questions, and responses, and that forms is just a row per form. Well, in DBT, I have forms, questions, and responses. And in forms, this is the SQL that is actually being run on that raw Google Forms data. So I am getting the ID. I'm getting this ID. But then with this JSON string, I'm using JSON value to look at the string, and extract just info document title. So that is info document title, and then I get sample survey for ETL returned. So I've got that here, and then I have longer ones for questions that you can read through and responses. This responses one was really interesting to create because I had to create a temporary function that was a JavaScript function to actually pass some of the data in to parse it properly. And so that was really interesting to use because when you go into the raw responses, what I found was that the items there, they had keys that were dynamic. And so, for example, we've got this here. This is my hot dog question here. This is a dynamic question. And so I couldn't just say, like I did with info document title, I couldn't just hard code that into the SQL. I had to pass this string into JavaScript and have it parse out the different pieces of data. But figured that out, got that in there. And so now I have my 3, and then there's the schema file. This is another reason for why DBT is really great to manage this work, and that's that DBT allows you to document your data models and write tests on that data model. So, for example, that forms table, it is 1 row per Google form fetched from the API, and it is a column called form ID, and that column is unique, not null, and at least 1. What that means is that there has to be a value in that column, and you cannot have that value twice in the table. And so it is a unique value. DBT also allows you to maintain referential integrity. So questions, okay, I've got this questions table. This questions table has data for certain forms. These form IDs should be in the forms table. And I can tell DBT that. What I say is form ID has a relationship to forms form ID. And so it will throw an error if there are questions in the questions table for a form ID that are not in the forms table. That's really great and helpful. So I have that here. And then under my reporting folder, I have my Google Forms SQL. And this is the SQL that gets run to query those 3 new Google Forms tables to create my reporting table that gets visualized in Google Data Studio. And so that is how I recommend that you pull Google Forms data. I recommend you use a data orchestration tool such as Dagster or Airflow to manage all of that work. Previously in this channel, I used Cloud Data Flow and Google Cloud Functions. I'm going to do a future video that uses Google Workflows as the orchestration tool. And so that's more of your serverless option, which is really appealing to me right now. And then Dagster is another option where you can have this one code base where everything is defined and then it runs in Dagster. And so don't pull from the Google Sheets responses. Use the Google Forms API. Get that data into your cloud data warehouse. Remember, we work on the ELT way, so get the data into BigQuery, its raw state, and then use dbt to build your data models. You've seen me do that with Canvas data, Google Forms data, everything. It's just all roads lead to BigQuery. Transform within BigQuery. And then you'll be able to create these visuals in Google Data Studio, and then plenty more to be able to build the things that you need to be able to tell the story behind your data. That's it. That's Google Forms. I'm Marcus Alcozer with K-12 Analytics Engineering. Please make sure you hit like and subscribe down below if you're interested in more of this type of content. Thank you.